Anything we need to take up before we bring jurors?
Your Honor, I want to mention we have one witness who's here who works for a funeral home in Fayetteville, and he is supposed to be working a funeral tomorrow. I told him I don't think we'll have any trouble reaching him, but if we were to go over for a few minutes just so we could finish him, I would very much appreciate it. So.
And I don't think I'll be able to.
All right. Well, let's see how far we get.
Okay.
I don't want to keep the jurors much past 5, but we can do what we can. Let's go ahead and bring it.
We're going to walk you through the sets of reports, taking your attention first to the 12/30/1991 report, which was called in by Quentin Bullock. And in that report, that case was not substantiated on the very first set.
Correct.
Which means they did not find sufficient evidence of improper care at that time.
That's correct.
And there's a notation, if I can draw your attention to B2811 at the bottom, that even though they didn't substantiate the case, where the social worker makes the note, case active for 2 months, no protective services issue, brother-in-law concerned because his wife, which I'm sure you figured out is the twin sister of the defendant's mother, is that correct? Because his wife cares for Antoinette and Antoinette's child, though wife agrees behind his back. Do you see that notation there?
Yes, I do.
And so there's some concern, it sounds like, that maybe Antoinette's sister may not be forthcoming with CPS, is a way you could read that.
Could, yeah.
And that, so at that point, the social worker may not have had enough information.
Right.
And at this point, to be clear, Travion is not born.
Correct.
And the relatives, at that point, from your reading and glancing, were willing to do what they could to help Miss Smith out.
Seem to be trying, yes.
Right. And then the second report, as we've been talking about them chronologically, is July 24th of 1994. And that's the one where there were some cigarette burns on Aaron and a concern about a black eye. That was called in, I believe, by Miles.
That was 92, not 94.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry. 1992. I apologize. And there was some concerns about the cigarette burns in that case. And in that case, CPS investigated it from what we can tell, and substantiated not abuse of Aaron, the older brother, but neglect, because Mom's story didn't seem consistent with the injuries. Is that safe to say?
Yes.
And the social worker at that point tried his best to follow up on whatever information Mom gave about how those injuries came about. I think she gives this person that was taking care of Aaron when it happened, and the social worker can't figure out who that person is.
That's
or whether
right.
It exists.
Yes.
But as a result of kind of having some concerns in 1992, that social worker transferred it to a treatment worker to kind of watch over the family at that point.
Yes.
And this is the time frame, if I'm correct, where Miss Smith is pregnant with Travion, because we're in the latter part of 1992,
Okay,
and they were living in the shelter at the Salvation Army.
correct.
And you said one of the concerns you had with this particular case is that someone at the Salvation Army, I can't remember if it was a social worker, some sort of person who presumably worked at the Salvation Army, had maybe some concerns that Ms. Smith might be using some sort of substance because she was gone for extended periods of time.
Yes,
But that was the only explanation, that is, gone for periods of time, why she suspected there might be some substance abuse.
right.
And there was some notes that the social worker made, and at no point did the social worker express any concerns about substance abuse in that report. Now we're talking 92 crossing into 93.
That's correct.
And you said that there was no mention of Travion being born at that point, but she does mention, or the social worker does mention in there, that she was pregnant with him.
That's right. She does. He does.
And we were talking about whether or not this second report, now 92 into 93, whether they had information about the previous case. And there is indication, maybe not at the very beginning, about the fact that the social worker who ultimately got this case does make notes of a previous unsubstantiated neglect report, right?
That's correct.
So, when we were talking about was information being passed along, at least from the first report to the second report, the second caseworker mentions that there had been an unsubstantiated report, which as a social worker obviously probably would raise some red flags. We've had this report, now we've got this second report. Correct?
Yes.
But at the time, again in 92, when we were talking about the family risk assessment factor worksheet, which you said seemed at the time to be somewhat unique to Wake County, or something maybe they were trying out to kind of document their things. On that particular document, specifically on B2825, mother appears capable and competent to provide adequate care was the social worker's assessment at that point.
Yes.
And it says further down, level of care and supervision have been and are questionable, however the child's needs appear to be met.
Yes.
And the next line specifically says no known history of drug or alcohol misuse.
Yes, which it does say that, which is somewhat contradictory to what was in the initial report, which I guess my point with all of this is that didn't appear to be explored or taken seriously. I don't know what.
Well,
but
you don't know if they drug tested her, do you? I mean, there's obviously no documentation of that.
No, I don't. But that was the opinion of the staff from the Salvation Army.
Again, because she was gone for periods of time.
I don't know what the source of their opinion was.
Well, that's what
that
you
was
said.
part of it.
Right.
That was part of it, but there could have been other factors, but that's all that's in the record.
And after that point, that is, after we've started from the July 1992 up until the early part of 1993, this is one of those times where mom seems to be making progress. She gets into housing, is that
Yes.
correct? And while you say there are some portions that seem to be sparse and other portions that seem to be a little bit more detailed, you can see in this set of reports from the second finding that they had, for example, meetings with all of the people involved to kind of talk about what's going on. Is that safe to say?
They did,
On
yes.
August 31st. And during this time frame, CPS not only is writing letters and letting people know, but trying to assist in getting washing machines, for example.
Correct.
And trying to help Ms. Smith with being stable in the new apartment that she has.
Yes.
And there were some home visits, and specifically looking in March of 93, they make notes that Aaron was appropriately bonded with his mother, and I guess Travion would have been about 4 months old at this point in March. They referred her to the jobs program. That was one of the things they referred her to. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And there was some talk in that report about helping Ms. Smith with child care. Do you recall that?
And they made those arrangements quite promptly.
In addition, by the time this case is closed in June of 93, it was the social worker's opinion at that point that Antoinette, and I'm looking at 2846 if that helps, Antoinette Smith is motivated to become self-sufficient. She had gotten a job, and she was encouraged to participate in the MOMS program. Do you see that?
I did.
Okay. And so they are looking at her. She's got this new baby and have referred her to a MOMS program, which presumably is some sort of parenting program for mothers.
Okay.
And at that point, again, she has custody of her children. They're making recommendations, and the case is closed. At that point.
Yeah, yes, she says the case is closed.
And then we go to the next set of documents in that regard, and it's the October 28th, 1993 report by, I think, a combination of Miss Cannon and Miss White. And there were concerns about the home not having heat and those kinds of things. And I think your statement was the social worker essentially found the conditions to be as reported.
That's correct.
And your testimony, as I understood it to be, that was that it, you know, there was concerns at the house and the clothing of the children, and you said, as I wrote down, that the bottles were crusty and had residue on them.
That's my recollection. In one of those two, it had that.
Do you recall the social worker just saying that they were dirty?
Could be.
Okay.
Yes.
Not crusty with residue.
Okay. That's possible.
And then you had some concerns as it relates to this case. And ultimately they substantiated. Again, they said, we found some concerns. Right. We want to make sure that we substantiate this case. Correct?
Yes.
And in this case, this is the one I think you documented that one of the concerns from Miss White was that Miss Cannon, as it relates to the call that came in, was, oh no, I'm sorry, I think I've gotten ahead of myself. But at the time that this investigation is, now we're in October of 1993, again, CPS and the social workers filled out the risk assessment factor worksheet, and Travion had already been born at this point, and the date on the factor worksheet was November 15th, 1993. So now almost a year old for Travion and a couple of years old for Aaron. Is that about right? Mm-hmm. And in that, the social worker found no concerns for physical injury. Is that correct? Looking
What
at
page are you on?
2856.
That's correct.
And the next one, talking about neglect, was no injury. Child was occasionally left unsupervised in a potentially dangerous situation. I'm trying to read as best I can.
It's a tough.
Some evidence that caretaker is unwilling to meet. I don't know if that's men or something like that. But so there was some concern, at least for a supervision issue, but no injury in terms of neglect. And again, when you look at the history of abuse or neglect, when we're talking about whether people have passed information along, this social worker now, in the third case, writes previous sub-report, correct?
Yes.
So again, when we're talking about whether they've passed along information, it seems like this social worker is aware of the previous reports.
Yes.
And this one was the one I believe you said you had concerns because the dictation of it was much later than when the initial report is. That is, it was called in October of 93, but she doesn't type it up to 95 for any number of reasons, which you might have speculated about turnover and those kinds of things. But after this case is occurred, they substantiate neglect, correct?
Correct.
The third one. And there are several recommendations made in this case, specifically fuel assistance. It looks like it says Gene English, and I don't know if I know exactly what that is. Exchange club, parent aid program, and daycare. So they make recommendations, including the parent aid, which again would be a parenting program to assist her with bonding with her children. Is that safe to say? Because you said that's important when you have a new child and stressor. And so again, the social worker recognizes that and recommends those services to Miss.
Yeah.
And then we go to the last sort of combination of reports where I think there was some concerns about, one was closed really quickly, then one stayed for a while, but sort of conglomerating early 94 on forward. There were reports which ultimately were identified on several occasions to come in from Miss White, correct?
Yes.
And this is the one where they gave lots of different examples about concerns about neglect from Miss Smith in terms of beer in the bottle and those kinds of things. Right. And this is the one where you had made that you were asked about whether Miss White had witnessed Laura Cannon tearing up Pico's butt, and then the further it says complainant doesn't feel this child should be disciplined this way, and his mother, I guess MO mother, not around to protect him. So that was sort of the rest of the story. Yes. There. And when this case came around, the case plan was to continue CPS treatment. So there really wasn't a we find it is or we find it isn't. Like you said, you couldn't find anywhere in the record whether we're saying yes, this happened, or no, it didn't. Or substantiated or non-substantiated.
That's right. It was non-substantiated. What I found in the record at that point, while it talked about CPS treatment continuing, there really wasn't an active treatment worker at that point. There didn't, there is my response at that point in time in looking at the record is that this looked like a time where there were lots of vacancies, because when there was finally a reconnection with a treatment social worker, it was somebody, the social worker acknowledged in the record that they were covering a vacant caseload.
Correct, right. And so they were trying to maybe make some explanation for the gaps.
Yeah.
And you had talked about the fact that there had been some speed memos, and just so the jury's clear, speed memos are when you go out to a house to visit someone and they're not home, and you say, give me a call for whatever reason.
Right.
I don't know if that's standard or across the way, but in Wake County, that's what happens. Okay. And there were a couple of times when it appears that the social worker went out to try and talk with Miss Smith and wasn't able to do that.
That's correct.
And so at some point during that transition from January, February, depending on the start date with the different reports, even into April, it's clear from the record that the children are not in the care of Miss Smith, although your thing is, or I think your statement was, it's not clear exactly how that happened or when that happened.
Correct.
And your concern in this report was that there was a home study for Aaron as it related to staying with Earldine Bailey, but there wasn't a home study with Miss Cannon.
That's correct.
But they did, in fact, have lots of communications between Miss Bailey and about Aaron and Miss Cannon / Mr. Clark, who now Dad has come back into the picture, at least according to these records, about certain aspects of the case.
Daycare and AFDC, yeah.
And the AFDC, when we were talking about who gets the money, it really was money to pay for daycare. Isn't that correct?
Well, there are two kinds of daycare. They were talking about AFDC daycare.
Right.
So I suspect, as I read, there was talk of AFDC daycare.
Yes.
There was also talk of who might apply for AFDC public assistance check at that point.
But several pages of documentation were related to the fact that Travion was in daycare while he was either in the custody of Miss Cannon or Mr. Clark, depending on who you sort of trust to be the caregiver, and that the daycare had expressed concerns to both parents that we need to get paid for this because the money's out. And so there were lots of calls back and forth. And it appeared that the social worker, Miss Peden, to the extent that she could, was trying to help whoever had custody of Travion to do that. And in that, and in this last case, the family, again, while there's some dictation, which just so the jury's clear, are notes that the social worker makes kind of about what I did on a day to keep it, like you said, if it didn't happen, if it's not writing, it didn't happen.
Right.
But they also filled out an assessment, a family risk assessment, again, now that they've got this new set of cases on April 26th of 1995, which is close to the end of closing the case. And if I can turn your attention to 2896, The social worker at that time found no concerns for physical abuse, sexual abuse, or emotional damage at that point for either child. I think it says NA, if I can draw your attention to that.
And you know, this is one where my response to it after reading the dictation was, it was not clear, it was not clear to me her basis for that was some visits to the children in daycare.
Well, she did visit them in daycare, that's clear.
Yes, and I guess what I'm, my response, I remember reading this and thinking, you know, I'm really glad they did this. Visiting a child in daycare is one way to see how they're doing, but they don't live in daycare. Their caregivers aren't in daycare. So yes, it is in there. My response to this was that it was, I was concerned that it didn't adequately measure risk because it only saw them in daycare.
Well, but she didn't have any concerns for abuse at
That's
that time.
correct. She did not. What
And
she saw was good.
And she didn't have any concerns for neglect either at that
Right.
time. And you were talking about visiting with them only in daycare. If I can turn your attention to the second page, or page B of that assessment, when it talks about child caretaker interaction, it says children have separate caregivers.
Right.
Both respond well to them in separate homes. Aaron with grandmother and Travion with father and at times aunt, correct?
Yes.
So it was the social worker's opinion that they responded well to both of their caregivers, that is, the defendant with his father and his aunt. That was her notes. I assume
That's what her note says.
Okay.
Which, again, I want to just get back to, part of the reason I have doubts about this particular note is just the sourcing of it, is that how do you know that when your informant is, who is your informant on that?
Well, but her testimony, or her documentation, is that the children respond well to these two individuals, correct?
And yes, that's exactly what she says.
And you don't know how many times if she saw them, but she made that note in her document.
She did make that note.
And so that's now April 26th of 1995 when the CPS record in this regard shuts and you weren't asked to review any additional record.
Sorry, I just didn't hear
April
you.
26th of 1995 is when she made that assessment
Yes.
about bonding and not concerned about physical injury. And after that point, either there aren't records or you were not asked to review them.
That's
where your
correct, yeah.
inquiry ends.
That's right when she closed the record.
And to be clear, at that point, Travion's about 2.5 years old. Just shy of 2.5 years old.
Okay, yep.
And at no point in these records did anyone document a physical injury to Travion, that is a bruise or a mark. The one that you were asked about actually was crossed out, isn't that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And there was some concerns for supervision and household composition that substantiated the neglect.
Yes.
And just to kind of summarize, in this case, at some point in those make sure I get the times right, from December of 91 until April of 95, which is 3.5 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? Yes. Child Protective Services in some regard assisted her with housing. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Assisted her with getting bedroom furniture.
Mm-hmm.
Assisted her with getting a washer. They also assisted her with getting fuel assistance in times when she was in need. Is that correct?
Yes.
They assisted her with getting or referring her to the jobs program, which presumably is to assist her in finding stable employment.
Mm-hmm.
They assisted her in recommending either the mom's program or the parent aid, which would be parenting programs, is that safe to say, in your recollection? That they provided daycare for both of her children for a period of time.
Correct.
And I think we already talked about the parenting aid. So those were some of the things that were provided, or at least suggested, and referrals were made.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. You get a long list. Some of them they provided, some of them they
Referred.
suggested.
Right. But at least there was a documentation in the report that these were referrals, and even I think one of them you said they made sure to help her fill out the referral.
That's correct.
And to be clear about your opinions in this case as it relates to your findings about the missed possibilities, your opinion is, in the very end, in summary, Wake County DSS provided some important concrete services in the second CPS investigation and follow-up. Crucial services that could have increased the capacity of Antoinette to provide safety and nurture to her children were recommended but never offered. So
Yes, and I think I said in my direct testimony that the particularly parent aid program and things that would the non-concrete programs that would help with bonding, with connection, with parenting ability, and then with substance abuse weren't really pursued.
And your opinion is as to both of the children in her home?
I'm sorry, I couldn't.
Well, you say to her children, so you mean to both Travion and to Aaron?
Yes.
I don't have any further questions.
Cross-examination?
Yes.
I'm sorry, redirect.
Redirect. Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Bierman, just a few things. When you were first starting on your cross-examination, there was a little bit of confusion about whether or not Claudia White sort of had, can't remember the exact word that was used, but backed out of her assertion that she was concerned about Laura Cannon tearing up Pico's butt.
Right.
And I think that was clarified at the end, that that what you were trying to explain was your memory of the rest of that paragraph, that the complainant didn't feel that the child should be disciplined this way with his mother not around to protect him.
Right.
And that was the lack of clarity there, is that
That's
you
right.
were trying to give your paraphrased recollection of that other part of her concern.
Yes.
Turning to, if you can turn to page 2815, B2815. Is
2815. Okay.
that the page in that second full paragraph where the initial investigation about the report of burns to Aaron, is this where the social worker is speaking to the employee from the Salvation Army?
Yes.
And is you had a little bit of a conversation with Miss Shakita about what that opinion of the employee at the Salvation Army was based on, that that Tony, Miss Antoinette Smith, might have been using drugs during her pregnancy with Travion.
Yes.
And that you and Miss Shakita discussed her being gone for long periods of time. Is there some sort of symbol there at the bottom of that paragraph?
Yes, there is. There's an arrow, and the arrow goes under the continued in back.
And is this one of those pages where we don't have the back?
That's correct.
So if there was more information about why the Salvation Army worker had those suspicions, they're not memorialized because that page is missing.
That's correct.
And if we can just turn now briefly to page 2854.
Yes.
You had a conversation with Ms. Shakita about the fact that you had characterized your memory of the narrative describing the bottles in the home as being crusty.
Yes, that's mine.
And if you read that second full paragraph, when you read that,
The second full paragraph?
the second full paragraph that starts with case initiated,
Oh, so I was looking for case initiated. It's underlined right in front of me. But the underline distracted me. An attempted home visit was made to the Harsnip Court address provided. Home at the time were Antoinette Smith, Travion, and Aaron. The contents of the report regarding the hot water, failure to bathe, and dirty bottles became virtually apparent during my home visit. The heat was off. The oven was open and turned on as the only source of heat. This created an immediate dangerous situation for two toddlers who were very active. Ms. Smith did not have a playpen, crib, or gate for their protection. The children did need baths, and bottles being used for Travion did have a crust of old formula on them. Clothes were not washed, and Ms. Smith appeared depressed due to these problems.
So is there a reference there to crusty bottles and not just dirty bottles?
That's correct.
And finally, you talked about the impressions of the worker who made the final decision to close the case and made those comments about Travion appearing to have positive bonding with his father and the person who the reporter believes is his aunt.
Right.
Can you look at page B2900? Part of that same
Yes.
family risk assessment?
It is.
And is there a note at the bottom in the, presumably the handwriting of the social worker?
Yes.
And what does that note say?
The case was assigned to the worker in March 1995 to complete. Worker not entirely familiar with the family. Case name is under Antoinette Smith, who lives in Durham, or lives, I'm not sure what that last word is.
But the worker definitely wanted a note in there that she was, or he was not completely or entirely familiar with the
Yes.
family. What's been marked, Defendants Exhibit 17 and 18. Can you look at those and identify them if you recognize them?
Yes, these are the DSS records that I reviewed.
And that's Defendants Exhibit 18?
Yes. And then this 17 is the report that I wrote and the documents that it was based on.
And the report that you wrote outlining the opinion that you testified
Correct,
about.
correct.
Your Honor, I would ask that these be admitted.
Any objection? They are allowed. All right, any recross?
Yes.
All right, thank you, sir. You may step down. It's my understanding that you want to call one further witness for this afternoon?
Yeah, he will not be alone.
All right, so members of the jury, there's another witness who has a conflict tomorrow, and so with your indulgence, this may run us a little bit over 5 o'clock, but let's move quickly through the witness if we can.
Thank you. The state will call Corey.
Place your left hand on the Bible, raise your right. Do you solemnly swear to testimony you give the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you, sir.
Stay.
Smith, can you introduce yourself to the jury? Tell them who you are.
My name is Travion Smith, and I'm Travion's older brother.
And are you his very oldest brother or his second oldest brother?
Second oldest.
And so Darius is older than you, and then after you are Aaron and Travion.
Yes, ma'am.
And who raised you?
My grandparents, Louise and Edward Smith, in Franklinton, North Carolina.
And did you graduate from high school in Franklinton?
Yes, ma'am.
And what did you do after you graduated from high school?
I attended North Carolina Central University for 3 years, and then upon leaving there, I entered into the Army National Guard, and I currently graduated from Fayetteville Technical Community College with an associate degree in applied science.
And did you get a specific type of degree?
Yes, funeral service education.
And do you do that type of work now?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And where do you work?
Wiseman Mortuary Incorporated in Fayetteville, North Carolina.
And is that where you need to be tomorrow?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, so let me just ask you a few questions about sort of your mom, and then I'm going to ask you some, and growing up, and sort of that, and some questions about your brother.
Okay.
So your grandparents raised you. How much did you see your mom when you were growing up?
Very little. Years at a time, I would say, by roughly 4 or 5 years.
Do you remember, or were you too young, but do you remember any time when she ever lived in the home with you?
Not that I can recall, no.
And what's your first memory of seeing her? Do you remember how old you were?
I would say around 7 or 8.
And you don't have any memories of her before that?
No, ma'am, I do not.
And how long do you think it was before you saw her again after you saw her when you were 7 or 8?
I would say 12 or 13. 12 or 13.
So when you say she was an infrequent participant in your childhood, you mean very infrequent?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And you grew up with your brother Darius entirely?
Yes, ma'am.
And did you also see your brother Aaron some when you were growing up?
Yes.
And did you also see your brother Travion some when you were growing up?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
And did you see them about the same amount?
No, I saw Aaron more.
And do you know Aaron's grandmother?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And does she have a relationship with your grandparents?
Yes, ma'am.
And would you see Aaron for holidays?
Yes, ma'am.
Would he come and visit other times during the year?
Yes, ma'am, periodically, yes.
And would he, how long would he stay when he came?
Sometimes he would stay a weekend. Other times he may stay a week. No more than 5 or 7 days at a time.
Would he be more likely to come when school was not in session?
Yes, ma'am. This was during the summer when school was out.
You say that you saw more of Aaron than you did of Travion. Did you see Aaron pretty consistently through all those years? Like, would you see him every year?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, I would.
And do you think you saw him, how many times a year do you think you saw him on average?
Between maybe 5, 10 times maybe.
And did you see Travion every year?
No, ma'am, I did not.
And how old were you the first time you remember being aware that Travion existed in the world?
Around 7 or 8.
And why did you become aware of him then?
I don't quite remember how I became aware of him, but I do remember us going on vacation. The initial time where I knew that he was my brother, I couldn't tell you that because I don't remember, but I do know, remember us going on vacation.
So, and did your grandparents take you and Darius on vacation often?
Yes, ma'am, every year.
And did you what kind of work did your granddad do when you were growing up?
He was a truck driver, 18-wheeler, big rig driver.
And what kind of work did your grandmother do?
Electronics.
Did she, did she work in some sort of factory environment?
Yes, ma'am. Flextronics, and what they did was put circuit boards together for like gaming systems and computers.
And she stayed there until she retired?
Yes, ma'am, she did.
And so they were able to take you and Darius on vacation every year?
Yes, ma'am.
And would Aaron sometimes come with you on those vacations?
Yes, ma'am.
And did Travion come on those vacations at least once, you've told us?
Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
And how many times do you remember Travion coming?
From what I can remember, 3.
And the first time you remember him was one of those family vacations?
Yes, ma'am.
And what, if you remember that first time meeting him, how did he seem? What sort of things seemed to make an impression on him?
He was quiet, and he was kind of just taking it all in. I can tell it was something that he wasn't used to, but for the most part, he was just quiet. To sum it all up, he was just quiet and kind of bashful, kind of shy. From what I can remember, that's all I can remember.
And when you say he was kind of just taking it all in, what kinds of things would you do that he seemed to really be struck with?
As far as like vacation or just in
Anything.
general? Something as simple as going out to eat to a restaurant, or getting sweets, getting ice cream or something like that. I can tell it wasn't something that he was quite used to.
And do you remember anything about his appearance that was striking to you as a kid?
I could tell that he was less fortunate than me and my older brother. He was not very well kept as me and my brother Darius was.
And by that, what things, do you remember things about his appearance that gave you that impression?
It was mainly just clothes he wore seemed too big. Wasn't very clean. The clothes he wore wasn't very clean either.
Did he seem cared for?
No, ma'am, he did not.
When he would come, would he sometimes spend the night? Did he ever spend the night at your grandmother's?
Yes, ma'am, he did.
Did he ever bring a suitcase?
No, ma'am, not that I can remember.
Did he bring a change of clothes?
No, ma'am, not that I can remember.
Do you remember him ever bringing any toys or any kind of, thing he would sleep with or seemed attached to?
No, ma'am.
Did he seem to have been taught sort of the basic stuff about hygiene that other kids would know by that age?
No, ma'am.
How did Travion act that you can remember when he was around you and his other older brothers?
Joyful, playful, like any other kid would be. Always wanting to play. I didn't sense any sign of envy or jealousy or any displaced aggression or anything. It's just a joyful kid. Just wanted to play all the time, and that was it.
Even though you've said that it was pretty clear that you and Darius had, I think you said, a more fortunate life than he was, you never got any sense that he was jealous of that?
No, ma'am, not at all.
Angry about that?
Not at all.
And was he interested in what his big brothers were doing?
Yes, ma'am, very interested.
And how could you tell he was interested in all of you?
Just by him wanting to be around us, up under us, all day, every day, copying everything we did, you know.
What kinds of stuff will he copy?
Just the way we would wear our shirt or wear our jeans or lace up our shoes. Anything that we did, he wanted to mimic, shadow us in a sense.
And you mentioned that he would never come with anything when his father would drop him off. Would he leave with things?
Yes, ma'am.
Who was it that you remember telling you about the fact? Well, first of all, what would he leave with?
Clothes, toys, anything, food, anything, but mostly clothes and toys.
And would you give him clothes that you were still wearing, or would you give him clothes that you and Darius had outgrown?
Both. I would give him clothes that I was currently wearing and clothes that I couldn't fit anymore.
And was there somebody in your family that encouraged you to be generous about that?
Yes, my grandmother, Louise.
Do you remember there ever being a time that your grandmother wanted you to give him something that you didn't want to give him?
Yes, it was one particular time where it was a trophy that I had got from playing rec football in football league that my grandparents signed us up for, and it was a particular time he stayed with us a couple of days, and he asked every day could he have it, and she made me give it to him, and so I did.
And did Travion like to play sports?
Yes, when he was with us, we played like football on a trampoline or football in the backyard, basketball.
And was that one of the things he seemed to enjoy?
Oh, yes, ma'am.
And so your grandmother made you give him your rec sports trophy.
Yes, ma'am.
And what kind of impact, how did Travion react to getting that trophy?
He was overjoyed. As if he never ever received anything before. He was very happy to receive that, and I didn't understand at the time, but now I understand why he was happy, and I could tell that it meant a lot to him.
And you can understand that better now. Why?
Because at the time I didn't understand. I was a kid myself, so I didn't understand. You know, to me it was just something I was used to, but I could tell that it wasn't something that he was used to.
Sort of like ice cream or going out to dinner. It wasn't anything that was a big deal to you.
Right.
But it was clearly a big deal to him.
Yes, ma'am.
And do you wish that you had been able to see more of your brother Travion when you were growing up?
Yes, ma'am, every day.
And do you know why your grandparents raised you and Darius?
From what I've been told, just I don't want to sound cruel about it, but I guess our mother didn't want us. That's what I've been told. I don't know any other way to put it than to put it like that. But from what I've been told, and she left us on several occasions, and to the point where my grandparents had enough, in a sense, and so they took us in.
And did your grandparents, how did they sort of feel like they had more capacity to take in Aaron and Travion when they were born?
No, ma'am.
Would it be fair to say that they had sort of had enough with their daughter at that point?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you love your brother Travion?
Dearly.
And do you want to be able to have a relationship with him and moving forward in your life?
Yes, ma'am, I would.
Cross-examination.
Mr. Smith, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So you graduated from high school,
Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
went to college,
Yes, sir.
and then you joined the military as well.
Yes, sir.
Why did you join the military?
At that point in my life, I didn't see any other route to go. At that time, I had a daughter that I had to take care of, and that was my best route. I had a plan to go. I wasn't going to go after active duty because I wanted to go back and come back to mortuary school, and then they would pay for me to go to school. So that was my main two reasons for going into the military.
So you made a choice to join the military to kind of further your life.
Yes, yes, sir.
And then you in fact graduated from school, from college, and you have a job now.
Apprenticeship, well, job apprenticeship.
And sir, you said Travion would go up and visit you in Franklinton.
Yes, sir.
How would he get up there?
Sometimes my aunt would bring him down. My aunt Binky, which is my mother, oldest sister, and sometimes his dad would bring him to my grandmother's house.
So your grandmother and grandfather are Travion's grandmother and grandfather as well. Is that right?
Yes, yes, sir. On my mother's side, it was my mother's parents.
Okay. When was the last time you talked with Travion?
2012.
2012.
I believe 2012, 2013. I don't quite remember the year, but it was around 2012, 2013.
Okay. And you described your relationship with him, that it was a loving relationship, that you love him dearly. Prior to 2012, did you give him some advice on kind of who the people he needed to hang out with and how he needed to stay out of trouble?
Every time I saw him,
Okay. So you
when I had the chance.
So you reached out to him and tried to help him?
With advice, yes.
Okay. And, sir, would you have helped Travion in any way that you could to help him avoid getting charged with murder?
I would.
Okay. If he had come to you and said, hey, can I sleep on your couch or something like that, would you have let him do that?
If I had a place to stay, yeah.
You would have helped your brother.
Yes, sir.
Did Travion ever reach out to you as his brother and ask you for any help?
Not to my knowledge, no.
And have you talked to him since he's been locked up?
Once that I can remember. I believe once or twice.
Did you call him or go visit him?
On the phone.
On the phone. Thank you. I don't have any further questions. Redirect.
You were living in Fayetteville in 2013?
Yes, ma'am, I was.
And was your brother Aaron living in Florida, or was he deployed at that time?
I'm not sure. I think he was living in Florida. Jacksonville, Florida, I believe.
All right, thank you, sir. You may sit.
All right, thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll recess for the afternoon. At this time, resume tomorrow morning at 9:30. Please recall all the rules and instructions. Don't talk among yourselves or with anyone else about the case. Don't form or express opinions about the outcome. No media or independent investigation in these matters, and no conversation or communication with parties, witnesses, or lawyers. If you leave your notepads in your chairs, we'll see you at 9:30 tomorrow morning in the deliberation room. Everyone else, please remain seated, please. All right, outside the presence of the jury, are there any matters that need to be brought to my attention before we recess?
Just a little bit of a preview with scheduling. I don't know how long it will take us to finish tomorrow. I just want to say that if we do get to the point that we do finish tomorrow, we are going to need some time to prepare for a charge conference, given the nature of the fact that we have to prepare mitigating circumstances. And we've been looking on the other parts about it. So that is something that does take some time to do.
Do you have anything?
I mean, of course we'll need to have that.
Well, so there's some possibility that you will finish your evidence tomorrow?
I think there's a possibility. I always hate to make predictions like that, given the nature of it, but it does seem at least certainly possible. And if that is so, we will not be having prepared mitigation.
Well, and we've also committed to, I know the one juror has an issue Friday afternoon, so we've committed to recess no later than 1 o'clock on Friday. So let's see how far we get tomorrow, and we'll make the best decision we can as far as having opportunity for a charge conference, giving you an opportunity to prepare proposed instructions on mitigating circumstances, and all of that. We'll see how far. We'll just have to see how far we are and assess the schedule as we go forward. All right. Anything else? Very well. Thank you. All right. We'll be in recess until 9:30 tomorrow morning.